Bright lights blazed down on the sleek, polished set of the evening talk show, their artificial glow making the air feel thick with expectation. The audience hummed with excitement, a sea of eager faces waiting for the moment they knew was coming. Cameras hovered like watchful sentinels, their lenses focused on the elegantly poised figure seated across from the host. Melania Trump sat with effortless composure, her expression an unreadable mask of practiced grace. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue dress that hugged her frame with quiet authority, she crossed her legs with deliberate precision. Her presence was magnetic, regal, untouchable, yet carrying an unspoken sharpness beneath the surface. She had been in the public eye long enough to recognize the atmosphere in the room. It was the kind that signaled a storm before the first drop of rain ever touched the ground. The host, a well-known liberal provocateur, leaned forward with a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. His name was Richard Vaughn, a man who thrived on controversy, his reputation built upon the wreckage of high-profile interviews gone wrong. He lived for the moment when his guests faltered, when their carefully built walls cracked under the pressure of his biting questions. But Melania was not like the others. Richard adjusted his tie, his eyes flickering with a glint of amusement as he set the trap he had prepared so carefully in his mind. The audience sensed it too, leaning forward, ready to witness the moment where the former First Lady would be caught off guard, where her composed exterior would finally slip. Then, with the precision of a dagger sliding between ribs, Richard asked the question, "Melania, do you ever regret marrying Donald?" The room seemed to still. Even the air felt heavier. The words hung there, a carefully poised grenade waiting to explode. A lesser woman might have gasped. A lesser woman might have stumbled. But Melania merely blinked, her expression utterly unchanged. If anything, the faintest flicker of amusement ghosted over her lips, so brief it was almost imperceptible. The silence stretched long enough to make Richard shift ever so slightly in his seat. The audience was waiting, breath held, eyes locked on the woman who had been placed in the lion's den. And then, with the ease of a seasoned gladiator stepping onto the sand, Melania leaned forward just slightly. "Regret?" she said, her voice like smooth, unshaken velvet. "Do you regret your marriage, Richard?" The host hesitated for half a second too long. A ripple of laughter stirred through the audience. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of heat burned in Richard's eyes, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle, as if to suggest he was unfazed. But the game had already shifted. Melania's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of her chair, her expression unreadable. "You see," she continued, her tone measured, "people like you. They think they know everything about my life, about my choices. But tell me, what do you know, really?" Richard opened his mouth, ready to retake control, but Melania was faster. "You know headlines, gossip, speculation." She tilted her head slightly, a gleam of quiet challenge in her eyes. "But tell me, what do you really know?" The audience was fully in her hands now. Richard, who had walked into this conversation expecting to unnerve her, was suddenly the one on uncertain ground. And Melania knew it. She shifted, resting her chin lightly on her hand. "I don't waste time with regret. Regret is for those who don't understand their own choices. Do you understand yours, Richard?" For the first time in his career, Richard Vaughn found himself the one being questioned. And for the first time, he had no answer. Richard Vaughn's smirk had vanished, replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. He had underestimated her. That much was clear. But men like Richard didn't take well to losing. He straightened in his chair, feigning a relaxed demeanor, but his fingers twitched slightly against his cue cards, a subtle tell. The audience, though still captivated, was waiting for him to regain control, to steer the interview back into the ambush he had planned. "That's an interesting way to avoid answering," Richard said smoothly, though there was a sharpness in his tone now, a barely concealed irritation lurking beneath his polished exterior. Melania gave a slow, almost indulgent smile, the kind that suggested she had expected this exact response. "I don't avoid. I just don't entertain foolish questions." The audience reacted instantly, some laughing, others gasping at the boldness of her retort. Even the production crew, hidden behind the cameras, exchanged glances. This was turning into something far more electric than they had anticipated. Richard pressed his palms together, the edges of his nails digging into his skin as he fought to maintain control. Foolish, he echoed, letting the word hang. You're saying it's foolish to question whether you've ever doubted your marriage? Melania tilted her head slightly, eyes glinting under the bright studio lights. No, I am saying it is foolish to think you deserve the answer. The words hit like a slap. Richard inhaled sharply through his nose, masking his frustration with a practiced chuckle. Well, he said, shifting in his seat, we are on a talk show, after all. Questions are the nature of the business. Melania remained utterly composed. One leg crossed over the other, her hands resting gracefully in her lap. And evasion is the nature of politics, yes? Richard pushed, his tone taking on a new, dangerous edge. The room tensed. Melania's gaze didn't waver. So this is not about me. It is about him. There it was. The moment the conversation had truly turned. The audience felt it, the sharp crackle in the air. Richard's smirk returned, though this time, it was more akin to a predator sensing an opening. Well, since you brought it up, he said, his voice dripping with feigned innocence, I have to ask, what is it really like, being married to Donald Trump? The world sees one thing, but behind closed doors, I imagine it's quite different, isn't it? There was a beat of silence so heavy it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Melania blinked once, slow and deliberate, and then she leaned forward. Behind closed doors, she repeated, her accent lacing each syllable with an undeniable sharpness. Tell me, Richard, do you speak from experience? Are you different behind your closed doors? The question landed like a thunderclap. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Richard's jaw tightened for the briefest moment before he quickly masked it. But Melania saw it. She saw everything. She let the silence stretch, let it suffocate him just long enough before she continued. Men like you love to think you understand powerful men, but you only understand gossip, not power. Richard exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair as if to signal he wasn't fazed, but his body language betrayed him. So, you're saying you do see him as powerful? Melania's lips curled ever so slightly. I see him as my husband, something you cannot begin to understand, because you do not see your own wife as your equal. The audience collectively gasped. Richard stiffened, and for the first time all evening, his smile slipped entirely. Melania didn't wait for a response. She sat back, calm, collected, and devastatingly in control. Perhaps next time, you should invite her here instead. I imagine she has a much more interesting story to tell. The crowd erupted. Richard's face paled for a fraction of a second before he forced out a laugh, though it was noticeably strained. He glanced at his producers, his eyes flicking toward the teleprompter, searching for the next segment to regain control of the situation. But there was no control left to take. Melania Trump had turned the tables so effortlessly, so ruthlessly, that Richard Vaughn, the man who made a career out of unraveling his guests, was left floundering in the wreckage. And she wasn't done yet. The tension in the studio had reached a fever pitch. The air was thick with something unspoken but palpable, a sense that the game had shifted in ways Richard Vaughn had never anticipated. He had walked into this interview thinking he was the predator. Now, he was the one bleeding in the water, and the sharks were circling. But Richard Vaughn wasn't the type to go down quietly. A flicker of something dangerous crossed his face. A man humiliated on his own show had two choices: retreat gracefully or go for the kill. And Richard was not a man who believed in retreat. He shifted in his chair, the false warmth in his smile evaporating as he let his true nature bleed through. You know, Melania, he said, his voice silkier now, more deliberate. There's something fascinating about the way you speak. So careful, so controlled. It makes me wonder, what are you really afraid of? Melania didn't blink. I am afraid of wasting time on foolishness, she said simply. Richard leaned forward, eyes narrowing. No, you're afraid of something else, aren't you? His voice dropped slightly, coaxing, taunting. You're afraid that behind all the glamour, all the carefully crafted words, you're just another woman trapped in a life she didn't choose. The audience gasped. The insult was razor-sharp, slicing through the air with the precision of a scalpel. For the first time all evening, there was movement behind Melania's eyes. Not anger, not shock, something else, something unreadable. She held Richard's gaze for a long moment. Then, she did something no one expected. She laughed, soft at first, almost amused. Then it grew, rich, controlled, and devastatingly cutting. A laugh that wasn't lighthearted at all, but something else entirely. The sound of a woman who had just decided to end someone. Richard's smirk faltered. He had been prepared for deflection, for cold silence, even for a sharp retort. But laughter? That threw him off balance. Melania leaned in, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "A man like you," she said, her accent curling around each word, "thinks he knows power because he can speak into a microphone. But real power? Real control?" She smiled, slow and deliberate. "It is not needing to prove anything to men like you." The audience exploded. Cheers, whistles, applause, waves of energy crashing through the room. But Richard wasn't finished. His fingers curled around the edges of his cue cards, his knuckles white. He had lost control of the interview, but he could still take something from her. If he couldn't break her composure, he could at least make her bleed. He exhaled, forcing a smirk onto his face. "You know, Melania," he said, tapping the corner of his cards against the desk, "it's funny. You talk about power and control, but in the end, you're just another woman standing in a man's shadow. No matter how much you deny it, you will always be defined by him." The words landed like a gunshot. The studio fell into a stunned silence. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the conversation had just gone somewhere darker. Melania didn't move, didn't flinch. Then, slowly, she reached forward, picked up Richard's coffee mug, and turned it in her hands as if studying it. "You know, Richard," she said, her voice almost gentle, "this reminds me of something my grandmother used to say." Richard tilted his head, wary. "Oh, and what's that?" Melania smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Men who drink too fast often choke." Then, with the grace of a queen dismissing a subject, she set the cup down, stood, and walked off the stage. Richard Vaughn was left sitting there, humiliated, furious, and speechless. The silence after Melania's departure was deafening. For the first time in his career, Richard Vaughn was truly at a loss for words. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still staring, waiting for him to say something, anything, to regain control. But there was nothing to salvage. Melania Trump had walked into his domain, into his battlefield, and left him defeated, not with rage or defensiveness, but with effortless, lethal precision. The clip of her final words, "Men who drink too fast often choke," was already being clipped and uploaded across social media before Richard could even take a breath. The fallout was immediate. Public reaction by the time the show ended and Richard finally stepped backstage, his phone was vibrating nonstop. His producer looked at him with a mix of shock and barely concealed disappointment. "That didn't go the way we planned," she muttered, eyes flicking to the screen where Twitter was already ablaze with reactions. Hashtag Melania destroys Vaughn, hashtag Melania unfiltered, hashtag talk show massacre. The internet had chosen its winner. Liberal commentators tried to spin the interview as an example of Melania dodging accountability, but the narrative had already been set. The world didn't see a woman deflecting. They saw a woman standing in the face of condescension and dismantling it with ease. Conservative media seized the moment, hailing her as a master of poise and intelligence, praising her ability to put an arrogant liberal in his place. Even those who had once dismissed her as a passive figure in Trump's shadow now saw something else, an iron will hidden behind a model's elegance. As for Richard Vaughn, his humiliation played on an endless loop. His reputation, once built on making powerful figures squirm, was now tainted by the one time he had been bested in his own game. Behind closed doors backstage, Richard paced his dressing room, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the comments. "She owned you, man. Brutal. You were so smug, and she wiped the floor with you. Damn, Vaughn, that was embarrassing." Everywhere he looked, the response was the same. He had lost. "Maybe we should spin this," his producer suggested cautiously. "Say you let her win. Say you wanted to expose her as a calculated manipulator." Richard turned to her sharply. "You think anyone's going to buy that?" His voice was tight with frustration. She didn't respond, because they both knew the truth. Melania hadn't just outwitted him, she had exposed him. She had shown the world exactly who he was. A man desperate to trap her, to make her stumble, to reduce her to a headline. But instead of crumbling, she had shattered him instead. Melania's perspective as the black SUV pulled away from the studio. Melania sat in the back seat, gazing out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed. Messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. Reporters wanting follow-ups, political figures offering praise. She ignored them all. This interview had never been about proving anything to the world. It had been about proving something to herself. For years, people had defined her by her husband. They had whispered about her, speculated about her, assumed they knew her thoughts, her regrets, her choices. But tonight, she had reminded them of something they had forgotten. She was not a victim. She was not a trophy. She was not someone's shadow. She was Melania Trump, and no one would ever question her place again. The world moved fast, but some moments lingered, replaying in people's minds long after the cameras shut off. Melania Trump's interview had been one of those moments. It wasn't just another viral clip, another internet sensation destined to be forgotten in a week. It had struck a nerve, one that ran deeper than politics or personal rivalries. For Richard Vaughn, the fallout was irreversible. The aftermath of defeat in the days that followed, his credibility took a hit unlike anything he had ever experienced. Sponsors whispered concerns, executives questioned whether his style, once praised as fearless, had now been exposed as arrogant and overplayed. Viewers who once reveled in his confrontational interviews now saw something different. A man who had been so eager to humiliate a guest that he had underestimated her entirely. He released a statement, trying to frame the moment as an open and honest debate gone awry, but the damage was done. His ratings dipped, his reputation soured, and his future at the network was suddenly uncertain. There was an unspoken rule in media. Once you became the joke, it was nearly impossible to recover. Melania's victory for Melania, the reaction was mixed but decisive. Conservative circles lauded her as a woman of strength and composure. Even those who had once dismissed her as passive were forced to acknowledge her poise under pressure. But more importantly, something had shifted in how the world perceived her. For years, she had been the subject of speculation. People debated her marriage, her decisions, her silences. But now, she had spoken. Not in lengthy speeches or grand political gestures, but in a way far more powerful. She had faced a man who had tried to reduce her to a soundbite and left him with nothing to hold on to. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone that silence did not mean weakness. That grace was not submission. That just because she had let people talk for years didn't mean she had nothing to say. The interview sparked larger conversations about the way women in power were perceived, about media bias, about the difference between strength and arrogance. Was Melania a victim or a strategist? A passive observer in history, or someone who had always known exactly when to strike? The truth was simple. She had never needed anyone's permission to be powerful. She had just decided, in that one perfect moment, to remind the world of it. Power was an unpredictable thing. It didn't always belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it belonged to the one who knew exactly when to speak. And when the dust settled, when the headlines faded, when the noise of the internet moved on to something new, one truth remained. Melania Trump had walked into that interview with nothing to prove, and she had walked out untouchable. Please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.